Okay, we're going to have a lecture now on population dynamics, and we will start by talking about the carrying capacity. So basically, the carrying capacity is the maximum population of a particular species that a given habitat can support over time. So look at the little graphic here. The barrel actually represents a habitat, so like the area in which the species lives. The water pouring out the sides represents population loss to various elements, and the water that is being added into the barrel represents new species within the population being born into that particular habitat. So let's talk about population dynamics in more detail. So basically, a population can grow until competition for limited resources increases and the carrying capacity is reached. Populations can grow rapidly, if they have ample resources, but as resources become limited, its growth rate slows and levels off. So ecologists see how it kind of makes an S-shaped curve. This is called an S-shaped curve, and it shows how an initial exponential increase is slowed and eventually brought to a standstill by limiting factors. This is called a logistic growth curve if it rises sharply at first, like it does here, and then it begins to level off as the effects of limiting factors become stronger. Eventually, the force of these factors, collectively termed environmental resistance, stabilizes the population size at its carrying capacity. So many factors actually contribute to environmental resistance, which we see right here, and influence a population's growth rate and carrying capacity. Space is one factor that limits the number of individuals a given environment can support. So, if there is no physical room for additional individuals, they are unlikely to survive. Other limiting factors for animals in a terrestrial environment include such things as like the availability of food, water, mates, shelter, and suitable breeding sites. Temperature extremes, as well as disease and abundance of predators, can also limit the amount of species. Plants, on the other hand, are often limited by the amounts of sunlight and moisture and the type of soil chemistry, in addition to disease and attack from plant-eating animals. In aquatic systems, limiting factors include such things as salinity, sunlight, temperature, dissolved oxygen, fertilizers, and pollutants. So to determine the limiting factors, ecologists may conduct experiments in which they actually increase or decrease a hypothesized limiting factor and then observe its effects on population size. As a population levels off, it often fluctuates slightly above and below the carrying capacity. Members of population which exceed the resources will die unless they adapt or move to an area with more resources. Which makes sense, right? So now let's talk about some terms that we need to know. So when we look at the graphic here, when we see A, the A right here represents the biotic potential of the species. B, this represents the overshoot, shows how the population overshoots the carrying capacity. So you can see here and here. C right here represents logistic growth. D represents linear growth. And this line right here, E, represents the carrying capacity or the maximum number of individuals that can be supported by a particular ecosystem. And you may have to be able to identify these different lines and state what they are. So be familiar with biotic potential, overshoot, logistic growth, linear growth, and the carrying capacity line. Now let's look at reproductive patterns. When we look at reproductive patterns, we can it's the same thing as pretty much a survivorship curve, where this late loss can also be termed type 1. This constant loss can be termed type 2, and the early loss can be termed type 3. This graphic basically shows that populations of different species vary in how long individual members typically live. The way to represent the age structure of a population is with a survivorship curve. So the late lost population lived to an old age. Humans fall into this type 1 or late loss curve. Because in a type 1 survivorship curve, survival rates are high when organisms are young and decrease sharply when organisms are old. In a type 2 or constant loss survivorship curve, survival rates are equivalent regardless of an organism's age. So in the constant loss, it doesn't matter if you're young or old, the survival rate is going to be the same. In the type 3 or the early loss, most mortality actually takes place at young ages, and the survival rates are greater at older ages. So examples for type 1, like I said earlier, include like humans and large mammals. Type 2 are things such as birds, and amphibians are examples of the type 3 or early loss. And this just shows an up-close graphic of what we were just talking about. Now we're going to talk about reproductive patterns between R-selected species and K-selected species. The thing to remember are that R-selected species tend to be opportunists, while K-selected species tend to be competitors. R-selected species are small insects, such as cockroaches. They can be pretty sensitive plants like dandelions. These R-selected species produce many, many offspring. They're usually pioneer species or in early succession. They come to maturity to reproduce early. They're capable of withstanding environmental changing conditions. They fluctuate wildly above and below carrying capacity. Adults are typically small in size, and they have little to no parental care for their offspring. They're typically generalists, and they have a low ability to compete. K-selected species, on the other hand, are late successional species. They have fewer but larger offspring, have a later reproductive age. They are not capable of withstanding environmental changing conditions. And we tend to see that populations stabilize near the carrying capacity for K-selected species. And the population or adults are typically larger in size than the R-selected species. And these species give some type of parental care for offspring, and they have a high ability to compete. So if we look at the difference between R-selected and K-selected reproductive patterns, what we notice is a difference between opportunists and competitors. So K species will be the competitors, while R species are the opportunists. There's a large number of smaller offspring with little prenatal care for the R-selected. And the K species, such as humans and large mammals, have fewer, larger offspring with higher invested prenatal care. And that will conclude the video lecture on population dynamics.